Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to take a look at a channel that many of you have been recommending to me for a while now, and we're finally ready to do it. It's called History Rebels, and it looks like most of their content, which isn't a lot yet, centers around the American Revolution. And as of this video, they're at about 9,300 subscribers. I think it would be awesome if we use the power of this history community to push them over 10,000 in the next 24 hours. So if you like what you see, please consider clicking on the link down in the description to my video here. It'll take you to their original content, and you can subscribe to them and check out all of their other videos without my commentary. I want to give a shout out to Warren. Warren, I'm sorry I don't have your address, so I can't say where you're from. And then Ernie from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. We're going to be taking a look at a story from Massachusetts today. So thank you both for your support on Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
It's 1775, and the plains of North America have been thrust into war. From Lexington to Yorktown, brother will fight brother as the once loyal 13 colonies fight for the mother country or for liberty and a new era. This is the story of the American Revolution.
So interesting right off the bat how he says the colonies fight for the mother country or for liberty. Because we have to remember, this was very much a civil war. This was village against village. It was brother against brother. It was town against town. In my own family, there were father against son. I had an ancestor who was a patriot whose father was on the side of the British. It happened. And especially down in the Carolinas, it was brutal, kind of very much divided.
Join us as we explore the key battles, the strategies, and the politics that will one day lead to the birth of a nation.
Interesting.
Over 150 years before the Battle of Lexington and the shots that will start the American Revolution, Europeans first begin colonizing the Americas. They settle in places like Jamestown and Quebec, and by the 1750s, the colonies have transformed from precarious trading posts to vast and complicated settlements divided.
Yeah, and remember, so for example, New York is originally New Amsterdam. It was a Dutch settlement, and that whole Hudson River Valley was Dutch. You've got an area known as New Sweden near what is now Philadelphia, where you had a lot of Swedish settlements happening. It was not just French and English and Spanish down in the South. There were other countries too, but they eventually get squeezed out. And then, of course, now with the what we call in North America the French and Indian War, what's called everywhere else the 7 Years' War, it's going to push France out.
By the leading powers of Europe. The British colonists bring with them a democratic tradition and fundamental rights, won over hundreds of years of warfare and rebellion.
Yep.
And with a high proportion of landowners, 60% of the male European population are eligible to vote, a far higher number compared to Britain.
That's a really good point. One of the main draws for people coming to North America was the abundance of land and the ability to become a landowner where you couldn't, and it was quite limited. And that's still the case, I think, in some ways. In the UK, there's a real problem in terms of availability of housing and land, and a lot of countries in Europe are dealing with that issue right now, whereas the United States has an abundance of available land, and that's what's going to push that westward expansion. And land ownership being your main criteria for voting, there's a draw there, and there's a natural element of self-determination that's going to be inherent in these colonies, because the kind of people who are coming to the colonies are going to tend to be the more independent thinking types anyway. So more and more you're going to start to get a kind of a divide, right, where there's a divergence between the people that are growing up second, third, fourth generation in the colonies, where they don't even really have any significant ties to the mother country.
Most of the 13 colonies have appointed or elected royal governors who are nominally in charge, their power being checked by local representative assemblies and councils. The elected assemblies decide on issues from local tax to militia budgets, but new laws, including the levying of new taxes, are also issued from Parliament in London, who perceive their authority over the colonies as absolute. In 1756, the first truly global conflict erupts, the 7 Years' War, with North America becoming a key battleground between Great Britain and her old enemy, France. Both sides rely heavily on native allies.
And that's why it's called here in the States the French and Indian War, because the British colonies were fighting against, it was British and their Native American allies against the French and their native allies. And typically, I don't know if it's still that way, but when I was growing up, the way the American Revolution is taught, it starts with the story of the French and Indian War, because everything that really leads up to the Revolution begins with the aftermath of that war, which was, in some ways you could argue, was started by George Washington, but that's a story for another day.
The colonial militias are also vital for the British in gaining an upper hand in the conflict, who now play a leading role in shaping their future on the continent.
We love treaties of Paris.
Although the British prevail and become the undisputed power in North America, they end the conflict financially ruined.
Take a look at this map for a second, because now that all this land has been ceded by the French, you see this area here on the kind of the western edge of the Appalachian Mountains, where it says Indian Reserve. There are treaties in place with the British and these Native Americans, particularly the ones who had been their allies, where, hey, we're going to keep our colonists on this side of the mountains. Everything on that side's yours. And that's going to become one of the key, not talked nearly enough about, points for why this war happens, is those colonists want that land.
And increasingly expect the colonies to burden some of the financial costs of their defence. But because they see colonists as already represented in Parliament by virtue of being British subjects, they equally see no reason to consult the colonial governments directly on how to raise these funds. Many in Great Britain are angered by the idea of taxing British subjects without formal representation in Parliament, as many of the colonists desire. This includes Britain's wartime leader during the 7 Years' War, William Pitt, who tells the House of Commons in 1766, "It is my opinion that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. It cannot continue a century. If it does not drop, it must be amputated."
Interesting. Pitt's a smart guy, and then his son's later on going to be the youngest prime minister in history at like 24 years old. They call him William Pitt the Younger. But yeah, taxation has been an issue going back centuries, right? That's where you get Magna Carta in the first place. Is you've got the barons who are demanding some kind of rights when it comes to this stuff. And one of the main functions of Parliament was to raise taxes. The king couldn't tax the kingdom just unilaterally. He had to do that through Parliament. And that's going to become one of the big sticking points in the English Civil War 100 years before this. So you'd think they might have learned a lesson there.
In the colonies, the levying of new taxes without consent is becoming a serious grievance. And although loyal to the king, George III, many colonists view their rights as Englishmen, including having a local representative government, as being ignored by an out-of-touch and duplicitous parliament 3,000 miles away. After several failed attempts at raising revenue in the 1760s, anger and resistance begin to rise to Parliament's meddling throughout the colonies. In 1767, the government in London attempts to demonstrate its power through a series of laws known as the Townshend Acts, which it hopes will raise much-needed funds and crucially pave the way for future laws that will make the colonies financially self-sufficient.
And listen, let's acknowledge here that this is all... It's not altogether unreasonable. Maybe they didn't go about it in the best way, but the idea of a tax to help pay for the overhead that the crown has in maintaining these colonies and their protection and all that stuff is not unreasonable. Now, could they have gone about it in a better way? Absolutely.
The plans backfire, and the Townsend Acts only pour fuel onto the fire. In Boston, riots break out, leading to the deployment of the regular army to protect.
So you'll notice something here. You notice how Boston looks then? It doesn't look like that anymore, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So here's what Boston looks like now, and you see it's very different now than what it was then. And I found this map here from National Geographic about how Boston made itself bigger, and now I've gotten this thing in the way here. But yeah, look at this. Look how much land has been added to the original. The green, the dark green is the original there, and all of this has been filled in the 300 plus years since 1630. It's pretty remarkable what they've done in Boston.
Local officials. Tensions boil over in the city, and an angry crowd provokes soldiers into firing. 5 colonists lay dead in what will soon become known as the Boston Massacre.
One thing that the colonists, particularly the ones who are pushing toward kind of bringing this to blows and the idea of maybe independence, guys like Sam Adams, one thing they were really good at was propaganda. Taking a situation where colonists were really threatening physical harm to armed British soldiers and got fired on, you kind of you could argue they got what was coming to them in a sense, but it becomes the Boston Massacre. And that's the way you take things. You egg them on, they respond, and then you spin it like it was an act of tyranny. Was it I think it was probably a horrible misunderstanding and mistake and a tragic situation that got out of control. John Adams is going to be the defense attorney, and he's going to get all of them off of their manslaughter charges that they were charged with, and all pretty minor penalties for the ones that did get convicted of anything.
Although the soldiers, known locally as regulars, are removed from Boston, tensions in the city remain high. 3 years later, to protest laws that undercut the price of smuggled tea, Bostonians dressed as Native Americans board East India Company ships and pour 9,000 pounds of goods into the harbour. The British government's reaction is swift and severe.
Yep.
To send a message across
Martial
the
law.
colonies, they introduce what will soon become known as the Intolerable Acts, which includes replacing self-governance in Massachusetts with direct British control.
And again,
However,
pretty reasonable when you're dealing with what amounts to insurrection. But that's the situation we're dealing with here, is that these little things that are happening, they ratchet up the tension a couple of degrees at a time. And so you'll have one side responding to what they see as tyrannical acts. And because of how they respond to it, the side that's being viewed as tyrannical already is going to do something that seems even more tyrannical. And so it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We want independence because you're a bunch of tyranny. You're bringing a bunch of tyranny on us. And then we just become more tyrannical to deal with you opposing what we see as perfectly reasonable. And it's just, on both sides, it just goes up and up and up.
instead of discouraging further acts of rebellion, the Intolerable Acts lead to the First
Make it worse.
Continental Congress in October 1774. In the city of Philadelphia, delegates meet from across the colonies to discuss a united response. Those who desire independence, known as patriots, are still in the minority, as most representatives still do not want a break from the crown. But Parliament's arrogance.
A lot of times this happens, right? When people start out to fix something that they perceive as broken, they're not starting out to break away altogether. Martin Luther with his 95 Theses and that whole thing, you know, the story of him nailing stuff to the church in Wittenberg. He started out with the goal of reforming, of fixing what he saw as broken in the church. He wasn't looking to start the Lutheran church. He wasn't looking to be Protestant and break away from the church in Rome. It ended up going down that road, but he didn't start out with that in mind. Like he said here, the idea here is to fix what's broken. It's not to start their own country, at least not at first.
Arrogance must be confronted, and a resolution is made to boycott British goods until the intolerable acts are repealed. In Boston, more extreme measures are taken. The now disbanded Colonial Assembly forms the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and starts training a militia for war. Massachusetts is declared to be an open rebellion by the new British authorities, who occupy the city of Boston but little else. The scene is set for a showdown between Parliament and the colonies. British General Thomas Gage is dispatched to Boston to take command of the quickly deteriorating situation. He knows the land well, having fought the French in North America years earlier, alongside colonists like George Washington.
So, for example, one of the early fights is something called Braddock's Defeat, which is an hour or so east of Pittsburgh. And Daniel Boone was there. George Washington was there. Thomas Gage was there. Horatio Gates was there. I think Charles Lee was there. A lot of guys who are going to be prominent names in the Revolution are a part of that.
Although suppressing rebellions and fighting wars in different continents is nothing new to the British Army, few of Gage's 4,000 men have seen actual combat. The general quickly begins regular patrols across the countryside from his headquarters in Boston, in a show of force to the rebel Provincial Congress and to boost the morale of his own beleaguered forces. But General Gage does not want war, and he plans to prevent it by capturing or destroying military supplies in lightning raids across Massachusetts. These raids have limited success and mostly serve to help better organize the colonial militias, with many units now being designated as Minutemen, who are able to rapidly respond to British movements.
So there's an important connection for this to some stuff that's going to happen a year or so later, when you have George Washington in late 1776. If you haven't seen my video on 1776, go watch it. But late 1776, he's got a very small army left. The British have a massive force, but they've spread them out all across New Jersey in like little 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 man groups. Specifically because here's a situation where you've got all of the British soldiers kind of in Boston, and by the time they're able to move them out to deal with where they're trying to deal with situations, the colonists have had plenty of time to respond. And so that's kind of, I think, connected to this in the sense that if he had spread his men out more, maybe he's able to rapidly address these things. But then there are your own problems with that, which are now you spread out what was one big force into smaller forces, and you can be a victim to a smaller enemy force.
Confrontations between British regulars and colonial forces remain bloodless, and where the forces do meet, they only trade insults, with the occasional fistfight breaking out. The regulars are used to seeing armed militia protests, which are a common feature of colonial life, where locals demonstrate their rights as Englishmen as opposed to threatening violence. In March 1775, however, the more radical Massachusetts Provincial Congress decides that any large British force leaving Boston is now to be opposed with armed resistance. At the same time, Gage receives his own escalatory orders from an intransigent government in London to disarm the colonial militias and imprison the ringleaders, setting the two sides on a collision course.
I love how he framed that right there, about how at the same time on both sides you have a ramping up of the of the situation to where it's inevitable that something's going to happen. The colonists have decided that any British force leaving Boston is going to be opposed. At the same time that Gage, who doesn't want war, and it actually he's got a lot of love for the colonies, has been ordered to go out and disarm the militia. So it's inevitable now that there's going to be conflict.
Gage hatches a plan to capture the rebel leadership and large military stores in the nearby town of Concord. In one fast and secret expedition, he hopes to deal a fatal blow to the nascent colonial revolt. He prepares a small force of 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, giving him strict instructions to respect the rights of local inhabitants and their private property, but also to request reinforcements if resistance is met. But the Massachusetts rebels had been expecting such a move, and the evening before the raid, patriots catch wind of the plans in Boston and ride out to warn the Congress leadership and militias, narrowly avoiding British patrols.
And this is something that all throughout the Revolutionary War, the colonies and the United States later are going to be very good at, which is having that intelligence on the ground in the cities, places like New York with the Culper Ring. But here in Boston, you've got the likes of Paul Revere and Prescott and others. So Paul Revere is not the only guy that rides out, and he actually is going to get captured pretty early on in his ride, and he'll only be let go later on when the fighting starts. There's that very famous poem, "One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm."
Because the land route to Concord is closely watched by rebel sympathizers, in the early hours of the 19th of April, Smith's force row across the bay in an attempt to maintain the element of surprise.
Yep.
They disembark into waist-deep water and by 2 a.m. begin their 18-mile march to Concord in soaking boots.
And this is important to note because you have to think about these guys. It's 2 a.m. They're wet. They're already going to be tired. They've got a long march ahead. They're going to be exhausted, and they're going to have to deal with combat for a good bit of the day.
Because no resistance is expected to speed up their movements, each soldier is carrying limited ammunition, a decision that will prove disastrous later in the day. As the British march, Colonial riders are spotted moving west ahead of the column. Smith then hears reports from his forward units that large militia forces are gathering at Lexington, unnerving news which quickly spreads throughout the ranks. Smith knows they've lost the element of surprise and sends word back to Boston asking for reinforcements.
Which is the smart move that he's going to make, because that's going to save him from complete annihilation or capture in the end. So the militia, like at Lexington, for example, gathers once and then disperses because nothing happens. They gather too early, and they're actually going to have to discharge their weapons that have been loaded, because you can't walk around with a loaded weapon, and the only way you really unload it is to fire it. And so Paul Revere, who's been captured by this point, is going to hear that firing and think that a fight has broken out when it's really just the guys discharging their weapons.
As British forces arrive in Lexington, the town's militia is present. As with previous confrontations, neither side expect bloodshed, and the militia of 80 men under the command of John Parker is purposefully not blocking the road to Concord or intending to fight regular troops.
They're really just demonstrating. They have no intention of fighting. Not what happens.
Parker tells his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Without orders, a British advance guard moves on to Lexington Common instead of marching past to Concord. Commanders on both sides tell their men not to fire, and the militia is told to disperse. 100 local spectators watch on curiously as the two forces casually hurl insults at each other. As the militiamen slowly begin to leave, a single shot rings out from somewhere on the surrounding common. In the immediate confusion, other shots start to be fired from both sides until the British company volley fires without orders. Although those on the field do not yet know it, the first blood has been spilt of the American Revolutionary War, and 8 militiamen lay dead on Lexington Common.
Yeah, no British are killed in this initial confrontation. It's 8 militiamen who are all now buried there where they fell. They were initially buried elsewhere, but they were later exhumed and brought to Lexington Green. It's a really cool place to visit if you ever get the chance, and there's a museum nearby right on the green there where there's a place where they would meet, like a tavern. It's got some really cool artifacts in it. But this is not, a lot of times you hear people talk about the shot heard round the world. That ain't it. That's what happens at Concord.
Smith regains control of the situation and berates his stunned officers, reminding them of Gage's orders. The troops are recalled, and the march continues apace to Concord.
And Pitcairn, by the way, the guy who's in command at Lexington, will later be killed a few months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he's actually buried in Boston under a church.
The day is young, and Smith hopes they can still complete their mission, despite the unwelcomed setback at Lexington. Upon arrival into Concord, the British search buildings where residents give them permission and burn the small amounts of contraband they can find. But there are no rebel leaders or large military stores, as anything and anyone of value has been dispersed hours earlier by the rebels. By 9 a.m, 400 Colonial militia have concentrated in the surrounding hills under the command of Colonel Barrett. They have heard rumours of the events at Lexington and now see smoke coming from Concord. Assuming that the regulars are burning the town, many are surprised and angered by the apparent escalation, but they are not afraid to meet fire with fire. The exhausted British regulars resting in the town are still unaware of the dramatic change of sentiment or of the large numbers of militia that are slowly surrounding their position.
That's the thing. I mean, they are swarming from all over the countryside toward the British. This is a classic case of, holy cow, what did we just get ourselves into? They've already been going at it for more than 8 hours at this point. They've got to be exhausted. They've already had a confrontation once. It's already been escalated once. Now it's about to really escalate.
Now watched on by the evacuated townspeople, Barrett and the militia resolve to save the town, and they advance. Barrett's force quickly rout the 90 regulars holding the bridge, but lightly stunned by both the escalation and their success, they fall back to the hill and regroup.
And this is where, if you go there, they'll say that is the shot heard around the world at the bridge. There are a couple of British soldiers who are buried there, right at the bridge where they were killed. Those are the first British soldiers to be killed by colonists in what is now the Revolutionary War.
There are now over 1,000 militia surrounding Concord, and Smith knows it is time to leave. The regulars spread out beyond the road for protection and start the march back towards Lexington. But columns of militia are ominously shadowing their movements, and a race begins to the first bridge.
So you've got several advantages here for the colonists, right? You've got an exhausted force that's out way beyond its base. They don't know if or when they're getting reinforcements that he called for hours ago. You've got these colonists who know the territory, who don't have to march in column but can just run along and hide behind the trees and just pick at you the entire time going back.
The situation has now seriously changed for Smith and his men, who were perilously outnumbered and far away from the safety of Boston Harbor. Shots start to ring out, and the regulars take casualties as they cross the bridge. British skirmishers attempt to flank the militia, who position themselves well behind walls, trees, and undergrowth. Those they catch are killed, but most of the militiamen have spent years fighting and living in the rugged terrain of North America and delivered disciplined and effective musket fire before moving position. As the speed of march increases in sheer desperation, the regulars are repeatedly ambushed by the now over 2,000 strong militia.
2,000.
Casualties are starting to mount as the British tactical formations are no use in the wooded countryside, and what little ammunition they have starts to run low. They spread out where they can, but at narrow passes, like at the now infamous Bloody Angle, discipline and cohesion starts to break down as the force.
And honestly, as I said earlier, if it weren't for the fact that he had sent that call for reinforcements hours ago, I don't think any of these guys make it back to Boston.
Fights for its life. The Lexington militia under Parker, who was scattered by the British just 8 hours earlier, are now back and ready for revenge. Parker prepares his men well in a wooded hill overlooking the road. As they open fire, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, is hit in the leg and falls from his horse, wounded. Desperate fighting continues up to a last ambush outside of Lexington, where the British, now exhausted from 14 hours of marching and fighting, are on the verge of surrender. Smith and his men stagger into town, defeated by their superior tactics, tenacity, and the sheer numbers of Colonial militia. But just as all hope seems lost, cheers erupt in the British ranks. Smith's message for reinforcements has been answered. Under the command of Earl Percy, 1,000 British regulars are now surrounding Lexington with 2 field guns. Percy, taking overall command, reorganises Smith's battered force and rests them in the town. But the battle is not over, and although reinforced, the British are still hopelessly outnumbered by the now 4,000 strong Colonial militia, who show
Goes from 1,000 to 2,000 to now 4,000. And honestly, this is about... It doesn't sound like a big number, but when you look at a lot of the battles of the American Revolution, a lot of them are fought between forces that are 1,200, 2,000, 3,000 on each side. This is a pretty substantial battle for the beginning of the Revolution.
Show no signs of being cowed by the presence of British reinforcements. Percy soon continues the march, with Smith's battered formation in the middle of the column. A militia general, William Heath, arrives to take overall command of the Colonial forces. He orders the militia to now avoid large British formations because of the threat posed by the deadly field guns. Heath's forces must continually rotate to engage the British along the road, a time-consuming and difficult maneuver to carry out. Desperate street fighting and bloody hand-to-hand combat occurs as the British column enters the town of Monotony. Some atrocities are committed by the desperate and frightened British troops, as each building is cleared of sharpshooters. Many are killed on both sides in Monotony, including one militiaman who dies fighting from his home, telling his comrades, "An Englishman's home is his castle." The militia has large forces organised and waiting at Cambridge, but Percy decides instead to march towards Charlestown, rightfully cautious of a trap.
Yeah.
As the final hill is cleared of militia, the British column limps into Charlestown, to the safety of Boston Harbour and Royal Navy guns. The first battle of the American Revolution is over, and although it saw relatively minor casualties on both sides, the battle is nonetheless monumental.
Yeah, this is huge. And now you're going to settle into a siege, and for the rest of 1775 and into 1776, the Revolutionary War is confined to Boston for the most part. I mean, there's some little skirmishes here and there, but for the most part, it's Boston. It's this siege of Boston.
The war has now begun, and as the Patriot leader, John Adams, later writes, "The die is cast, and the Rubicon crossed." In the aftermath of the battle, and in what must have felt like the world turning upside down, trenches and redouts are dug around the city, and Boston is put to siege. In the days and weeks following the battle, volunteers from all over the 13 colonies march to join the army, and the militia transforms into a truly American force for the first time. Although they may lack the equipment and the professionalism of a modern army, they have nonetheless succeeded in their first test of what will soon become a grueling war. General Gage's strategy to prevent conflict has dramatically failed, along with the British government's plan to force colonial compliance without the consent of its people. In London, Parliament quickly blames Gage for recklessly starting a civil conflict.
Replaced him.
Despite the fact he was following their orders.
He was trying to avoid it, and all he did was follow their orders, and now they're going to replace him with General Howe and his brother Admiral Howe.
And even as the shots at Lexington are heard around the world, Parliament's position will not budge, and British reinforcements are soon dispatched to the colonies. What started out as civil and legal arguments over rights and taxation has now transformed into outright war in Massachusetts.
Yep.
The opening battle has ended in colonial victory, but the battle at Lexington is just the beginning, and the British will soon strike back.
Awesome. So that was really well done. I like that a lot. I think their next episode in this particular series is the Battle of Bunker Hill, so we'll definitely dive into that. If not tomorrow, then soon. We'll see how this one does first. But like I said, check them out. I would love to see us push them over 10,000 subscribers today. That would be amazing, and support them in making more content. Also, I will put up a link in the on the screen here in just a minute to my video on 1776, so you can kind of see what happens after all of this and kind of pick up the story from there. I want to give a shout out to Emily in Hong Kong and Steve in Rothwell in Australia. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.